When I joined Titan X Technologies as a senior product strategist, it felt like the culmination of everything I had worked toward for the past decade. I wasn't the loudest person in the room or the one constantly fighting for attention, but I had a knack for connecting dots others didn't see. My background was a mix of computer science and business strategy, an unusual combination that allowed me to bridge the gap between our engineers and executives. I was proud of that. Over the course of 5 years, I led 3 major product launches, all of which exceeded our projections. They weren't my ideas alone. Good work never is, but I had been the one steering them from concept to market. My role gave me direct access to the company's leadership. At least, that was how it was supposed to work. In practice, it meant navigating around one man, David Kessler, our Chief Operations Officer. David was the kind of boss who enjoyed control a little too much. He liked having people flinch when he entered a room, liked hearing his own voice dominate meetings, liked taking credit for ideas that weren't his. I had learned to manage him, to frame my proposals in ways that let him feel like he had the final say. It was a survival skill, and for the most part, it worked. Still, there were moments when I could feel the tension building. David didn't like when people got too much recognition, and after our last product launch, the one that drew praise from our board and attracted 2 major new investors, I could tell he was watching me more closely than before. My name had been mentioned in a Forbes feature about Titan X's growth. My inbox filled with congratulations from partners and colleagues at other firms. David had congratulated me too, smiling that tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. When he told me I'd be presenting at the upcoming quarterly meeting, I took it as a good sign. It was a chance to outline our roadmap directly to the board and stakeholders, to explain how we could build on our momentum. I worked on that presentation like it was my life's work. Clear slides, compelling data, a vision that I believed in down to my core, but I couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Something about David's tone when he assigned me the presentation felt off. He'd said it in front of the whole strategy team, making a point of adding, "I'm sure you'll make it memorable." At the time, I laughed it off. I had no idea how literal he meant it. The day of the quarterly meeting arrived with an almost electric tension humming through the office. I had rehearsed every word of my presentation at least 20 times. I knew the figures by heart. Revenue growth of 23% year over year, customer acquisition costs down by 15%, projections for the next fiscal year showing unprecedented potential. My slides were crisp, my narrative clear, my message focused. This was my moment to show the board, not just David, that our strategy wasn't only working, it was the future of Titan X. When I walked into the conference room, the air was heavy, with the smell of fresh coffee and expensive perfume. The board members were already seated along the polished walnut table, faces impassive but alert. Investors from Arcadia Capital were present too, their pens poised over leather-bound notebooks. At the far end of the room sat David, arms crossed, an expression that felt more like a smirk than support. "All right, everyone," he said as I connected my laptop to the projector. "Michael has been working on a bold vision for our future. Let's hear it." His tone was casual, dismissive, as though my months of preparation were an afterthought. I pushed the unease aside and began. My voice was steady, my confidence real. As I spoke, I saw heads nodding, pens scribbling notes, eyes flicking to the slides with interest. I emphasized key wins, showed growth trends, and then moved to the new initiatives that would cement our lead in the market. And then it happened. In the middle of my pitch, right as I unveiled the roadmap for our flagship product's next iteration, the screen behind me suddenly glitched. The slide changed to an entirely different deck, one I had never seen before. It was filled with outdated numbers, projections that looked wildly optimistic to the point of absurdity, and statements that sounded more like corporate buzzword bingo than strategy. I froze. "What is this?" one of the board members asked, adjusting his glasses. Before I could answer, David's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Michael," he said, feigning shock, "are you seriously presenting these projections? This isn't even close to what we agreed on." My heart pounded. "That's not my slide deck," I said quickly, turning back to the screen. "Something's wrong." David stood, gesturing to the screen with practiced outrage. "You expect us to believe that? This is what you've been preparing for weeks, and you bring us garbage to a board meeting? This is embarrassing. For you and for us." I wanted to scream. I wanted to explain that my work had been tampered with, that someone had deliberately swapped out my presentation. But in that room, in that moment, it didn't matter what I said. The board didn't know me like they knew him. David had been with the company for over a decade, his reputation carefully polished. I saw it in their faces, the shift from interest to disappointment, from considering me as a rising leader to dismissing me as an amateur. "Michael," one of the Arcadia partners said coldly, "this is not what we were promised. You've wasted everyone's time." The humiliation was like a physical weight pressing me into the floor. I wanted to defend myself, but every attempt only made me sound more desperate. David let me squirm for a few agonizing minutes before finally cutting me off. "That'll be enough," he said, almost pitying. "Clearly, Michael needs some time to recalibrate. We'll handle the rest of this discussion internally." By the time the meeting ended, I wasn't even in the room. David had suggested I step out so they could have a productive discussion without me complicating things. Hours later, he called me into his office. He didn't bother to sit. "You embarrassed the company today," he said flatly. "The board is furious. Effective immediately. You're terminated. We'll escort you out after you collect your things." It didn't feel real. I had given years of my life to Titan X, built its products like they were my own children, and now I was being discarded like trash because of something I didn't even do. As I walked out of the building with a cardboard box in my hands, every pair of eyes I passed avoided mine. The shame burned deep, but under that shame, something else was beginning to form. A quiet, cold clarity. Someone had set me up, and I was going to find out who. The first few days after my termination felt like free fall. I didn't eat much, I didn't sleep much. I replayed the meeting over and over in my head, analyzing every second, trying to make sense of how it had all unraveled so fast. The betrayal gnawed at me, but the humiliation, that was worse. The looks on their faces, the quiet pity, the way David stood there like a disappointed mentor instead of the executioner orchestrating the scene. It was surgical. He hadn't just fired me. He'd dismantled me in front of everyone whose respect I had worked so hard to earn. I stayed quiet for a while, partly because I didn't know what to do next, partly because I knew any outburst would only make me look guilty. But that quiet gave me time to think. I pulled apart every detail of what had happened, every choice David had made. That's when I began to see the pattern. The swapped slides weren't an accident. That entire scenario had been carefully constructed. David had controlled the room before I even walked in. The glitch wasn't random. It was timed perfectly. And the deck? It had enough authentic elements to look like mine if someone glanced at it quickly, but was filled with deliberate errors. It was the perfect weapon. I couldn't prove it, not yet, but I knew he had set me up. Once I admitted that to myself, something shifted. The shame began to harden into something sharper, purpose. If David thought I was going to disappear quietly, he didn't know me at all. I started by gathering everything I could. I combed through old emails, Slack messages, saved versions of my original presentation, calendar invites, anything that could show the timeline of events. I realized I'd been sloppy in one way. I hadn't saved my final deck locally the night before the meeting. It had only been uploaded to the company server. That meant David, or someone working for him, could have easily accessed it. I called Amanda, a friend in IT who had left Titan X months before. "Hypothetically," I asked, "if someone wanted to swap a file on the server without leaving a trail, how hard would that be?" "Depends on who they are," she said. "If they're C-suite, they could do it in minutes, and they'd know how to scrub the logs clean." Exactly what I suspected. But evidence was one thing. I needed a plan. I couldn't just march into the boardroom with a conspiracy theory. I needed a way to reclaim my credibility, to turn this from a petty personal vendetta into something bigger. That's when the idea came to me. I had always admired the way people used platforms like TED Talks to share ideas, not just about business or technology, but about resilience, transformation, the kind of human stories that stuck with you long after the applause ended. I'd watched enough of them to know what worked: authenticity, evidence, and a clear, powerful message. What if I could tell my story? Not as a bitter ex-employee, but as someone who had seen the worst of corporate politics and lived to turn it into something meaningful? At first, it felt absurd. Who was I to stand on a stage and talk about this? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I didn't need to prove David had sabotaged me in court. I could expose the culture that allowed people like him to thrive. I could show others how easy it is to be humiliated, discarded, and silenced, and why we need to build workplaces where that doesn't happen. And if I did it right, if I was honest, if I was compelling, I could turn the worst moment of my career into the catalyst for something bigger than revenge. I began to write. At first, it was just raw venting, pages of anger and hurt. But as I edited, refined, and structured, it became something else: a story, a journey of falling, breaking, and rebuilding. It took me 3 months to craft a version I was proud of. During that time, I reached out to people I trusted: mentors, colleagues from other companies, even a speaking coach who helped me shape my words for an audience that wouldn't know me. One night, staring at my laptop, I recorded a short pitch video and submitted it to the TEDx organizers in my city. I hit send with no expectations. 2 weeks later, I got an email: "We'd love for you to speak at our event." I stared at the screen for a long time, heart pounding. I wasn't just going to tell my story. I was going to make sure David, and everyone like him, couldn't bury it. Preparation for the TEDx event consumed me in a way no corporate project ever had. It wasn't about pitching a product anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity. My first draft was too raw, too angry, a thinly veiled rant against David. My coach called me out on it. "You're not here to take down one man," she said. "You're here to share something people can learn from. Make it about the message, not the man." She was right. So I rewrote. I stopped thinking of David as the villain and started framing him as the embodiment of something bigger: a toxic culture that rewards humiliation and punishes vulnerability. My talk became about resilience in the face of betrayal, about how people can turn their worst public failures into the start of something transformative. But I didn't leave out the details. I included the moment the slides changed, the sting of the boardroom humiliation, the quiet devastation of carrying my box of things out of Titan X. I didn't name David or the company, but anyone paying attention could connect the dots. Still, I knew it wasn't enough to simply tell my story. I wanted it to have weight. I backed up my personal experience with data: studies about psychological safety in workplaces, statistics about how humiliation kills innovation, quotes from organizational psychologists who've spent decades studying what happens when fear runs a company. The more I rehearsed, the more confident I became. I could see the story taking shape as something bigger than me. It wasn't revenge. It was a warning and a call for change. Then came the day of the event. I arrived at the theater hours early. The space was intimate but professional. A minimalist stage, black curtains, a single red carpet circle at the center. I had imagined myself here dozens of times, but standing on it for the first time made my knees weak. The room was empty, yet I could already feel the weight of hundreds of eyes that would be on me. Backstage, I went over my note cards for the 100th time. My coach's last words echoed in my head: "Don't perform, talk." Let them see the person who walked out of that boardroom. When my turn came, the host introduced me with a short bio. "Michael Grant is a product strategist and innovator who believes our greatest failures can become the foundations for our greatest growth." I stepped onto the stage, my pulse racing, and faced the audience. The bright lights obscured their faces, but I could feel them listening. I started softly, recounting the day of the board meeting, not as a play-by-play, but as a human moment. Have you ever been humiliated so thoroughly that you could feel your career unraveling in real time? I asked them. Heads nodded. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. As I told my story, I didn't shy away from the details, the glitch in my presentation, the condescending tone of my boss, the hollow walk out of the building with my box of belongings. I saw their faces change as they pictured it, as if they'd been there with me in that boardroom. Then I shifted. "But this isn't a story about losing," I said. "It's about what happens after, when the shame fades, when the anger becomes purpose, when you decide that one man's attempt to silence you will be the reason you start speaking louder than ever before." That line, "speaking louder than ever before," landed exactly as I had hoped. I saw people lean in. I spent the next 10 minutes sharing what I'd learned, that humiliation thrives where vulnerability isn't safe, that companies who mistake fear for loyalty ultimately destroy their own people, and that real innovation comes from workplaces where failure isn't weaponized. When I closed, I said, "We can't control who tries to tear us down, but we can control what we build from the pieces. And sometimes, those pieces can create something stronger than we imagined." The applause hit me like a wave. It wasn't polite or perfunctory. It was real. Long, sustained, people standing to clap. I walked off that stage lighter than I'd felt in a year. I thought that would be the end of it. A personal victory. A way to take back my story. But I underestimated what happens when a story resonates. 2 weeks later, my TEDx talk was uploaded online. Within a month, it had over 3 million views. My inbox exploded with messages. From strangers who had gone through similar humiliations. From professionals who wanted to collaborate. From recruiters offering opportunities. And then came the one that made me pause. It was from a journalist at Business Weekly. "I think I know exactly which company you were talking about," she wrote. "And I'd like to talk about what really happened." I stared at the email for a long time, knowing that this was the moment things would go from personal to public, and that somewhere, David was about to feel the walls closing in. I hesitated for a full day before replying to the journalist. The TEDx talk had been my story, told on my terms, without naming names or engaging in corporate mudslinging. Going on record with a journalist felt different, riskier. But it also felt inevitable. When I finally agreed to meet her, we chose a quiet cafe away from the business district. Her name was Julia Ramirez, a senior investigative reporter at Business Weekly, with a reputation for exposing corporate misconduct. She wasted no time. "I've had 3 sources confirm your story," she said after our introductions, flipping open her notebook. 2 current Titan X employees and 1 former. They told me about David Kessler's methods, the tampered slides, the humiliation tactics. You weren't his first target. Hearing it laid out like that, confirmation from people still inside, sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. Julia wanted more than just my story. She wanted the evidence I had gathered, my original files, the timestamps showing when my deck had been replaced on the server, the email threads where David subtly set me up for the fall. I handed it over, knowing full well that once I did, there was no going back. 2 weeks later, the article dropped. The headline hit like a thunderclap: "Humiliation as a Management Tool. Inside Titan X's Toxic Leadership under COO David Kessler." It was damning. Julia had corroborated everything with multiple sources. She painted a picture of David not as an isolated bad actor, but as the architect of a culture where public humiliation was a weapon, where rising stars were cut down before they could outshine him. My story was front and center, backed by hard evidence and anonymous testimonies from others he had targeted. The response was immediate and explosive. The article trended on LinkedIn within hours. Industry leaders weighed in, some defending Titan X, many condemning them. Employees, current and former, started sharing their own stories on social media, using the hashtag #humiliation_is-not-leadership. Then came the investors. Arcadia Capital issued a statement. saying they were quote 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 quote. The board had no choice but to act. Within a week, David was placed on, quote, administrative leave. Within a month, he was gone, publicly resigned, though everyone knew what that meant. But the story didn't end there. My TEDx talk, already viral, skyrocketed to tens of millions of views in the wake of the article. I was invited to speak at conferences, panels, and corporate workshops about psychological safety and leadership integrity. My inbox filled with messages from executives who wanted to fix their cultures before they became the next Titan X. And then, in a twist I hadn't expected, Titan X's new interim CEO reached out to me. "I know you have every reason to hate this company," she wrote, "but I'd like to hire you as a consultant to help us rebuild what was broken." I stared at that email for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let Titan X collapse under the weight of its own rot. But another part of me, the part that had spoken on that stage, the part that believed in turning pain into purpose, knew I couldn't. Accepting the offer wasn't about them. It was about proving that what David had tried to destroy in me could not only survive but make a difference. The first time I walked back into Titan X headquarters, I felt an odd calm. The same walls that had once felt suffocating now felt smaller somehow. People greeted me with quiet respect. Some even whispered thank yous as I passed. And David? He was gone. A ghost. His office stripped bare. His name erased from the leadership page. The man who had humiliated me in front of the most powerful people in the company was now nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in hallways. My TEDx talk hadn't just told my story. It had ended his career. Standing in the same boardroom where I'd once been dismantled was surreal. The long walnut table was the same. The smell of expensive coffee the same. Even some of the faces around it were the same. But the dynamic? Completely different. I wasn't here as an employee anymore. I wasn't here to defend my existence or beg for a seat at the table. I was here as a consultant, a voice they needed, someone whose experience and insights carried weight. The irony didn't escape me. A year ago, I had walked out of this building with a cardboard box, feeling like my career had been set on fire. Now I was walking back in on my own terms, not as a victim, but as someone who had turned that humiliation into fuel. In the weeks that followed, I worked closely with the new leadership to address what had festered under David's reign. We implemented programs focused on psychological safety, established anonymous reporting systems, and conducted leadership training to root out the toxic practices that had once been normalized. It wasn't easy. Cultures don't change overnight, but seeing people feel safe enough to speak up, to share ideas without fear of being torn down, was deeply rewarding. On a personal level, the journey changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. When I first walked out of Titan X, all I could think about was revenge. But revenge alone would never have filled the emptiness David left in me. What did was purpose. Taking the very thing that was meant to destroy me and turning it into something constructive, something that would help others avoid what I endured. I learned that dignity isn't about never falling. It's about how you rise after you've been pushed to the ground in front of everyone who matters. I learned that telling your story, honestly and unapologetically, can be one of the most powerful acts of resistance. And I learned that people like David, people who lead with fear and ego, always underestimate the quiet ones. They think silence means weakness. They don't realize silence can also mean calculation, patience, and strength. My TEDx talk still circulates, still sparks messages from strangers who tell me, "Your story gave me the courage to stand up." That's worth more than any title I ever had at Titan X. As for David, last I heard, he tried to land another C-suite role, but the shadow of his public disgrace followed him. That's the thing about building a career on intimidation. It collapses the moment people stop being afraid of you. I walked away with more than I lost. My humiliation became my platform. My pain became my power. And if there's one thing I hope people take from my journey, it's this. Don't let someone else's attempt to silence you define your story. Sometimes the very moment meant to break you can become the one that sets you free. Because in the end, justice isn't always served in courtrooms or boardrooms. Sometimes, justice is standing on a stage, telling the world your truth, and watching the people who tried to destroy you crumble under the weight of it. And that feels better than revenge ever could.